All right, it's showtime, people. First of all, so this is the Are You Serious? Better Game Design for Learning. We will not be doing any coding. There'll be no code examples. But what we will talk about is game design. And game design in particular for learning programs, whether it's for K through 12 or university or corporate education. It's a different mindset. And games for learning, let's put it this way, there's a lot of Jeopardy games out there. That is not games for learning, people. Okay? We're not going to learn Jeopardy for learning here. So my name is Ken Hubbell. I am the Senior Manager for Strategy and Innovation for the Learning and Development Organization at Wells Fargo Bank. And my side hustle is I do product. I'm the Chief Product Officer for an AI company. So we're doing some ed tech stuff. When I got started in this business eons ago, we tried to do learning games. And a lot of the games we were doing at that point in time were board games. You know, we had a lot of classroom education, and we did some board games, some simulations. And the challenge with a lot of those games was we didn't quite, at that time, even though we had the game theory book that a lot of people are familiar with, we didn't quite get the concept of transitioning from pedagogy, which is kids games, and adult learning and adult games, and the strategies that go into that, and the game design, to the point where we had a lot of people basically saying games are crap for learning. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Dr. Ruth Clark, but she's like the goddess of instructional design, and especially ILT, which is instructor-led training. And she basically said games don't teach. What she really meant was that poorly designed games don't teach. And she has come back and said that again. I think she was also really heavily saying games don't teach, at least the games that were currently on the market. So one of the challenges as instructional designers and as learning professionals is keeping students engaged. How do we keep people engaged? And that's an open question here. This is an interactive session. It is all about getting everybody involved. So I'm going to ask questions. So what's a good way to keep people engaged in the classroom like this? Interactivity. I'm asking you a question. You're going to answer it, I hope. You're going to have some kind of feedback. We'll have some kind of discourse. And magic happens, and you come away learning something. And that's great from an instructor-led standpoint, because I can look right at you, I can look at you, I can look at you. I can tell that she's asleep, but that's okay because she probably had a big lunch. And but we can draw people into the conversation about whatever the topic is that we're learning. You can do board games. I can take this whole entire classroom and split it up into smaller groups, and everybody can play a little activity, and then we come back and we say, well, what did you learn? And we talk about it and have a little discourse. It's a little tougher when you're doing it online by yourself. And even with multi-user games in the metaverse now, it gets a little tougher, because you have to come up with a way of doing a game that's not only going to teach them the topic in the context that they want to learn it in, but draw them in and keep them engaged long enough to actually learn something. So what is a game? Well, according to Ian Schreiber from the IGDA, it's a play activity with rules that involves conflict. I thought it was interesting that he threw the word in conflict, because conflict has a lot of different derivations to it. Am I conflicted with myself? Am I conflicted with you? Am I on a field of battle? I mean, war games are a big deal with the military. But it's also things like financial simulations, like what I do for the bank, and and those kinds of things, where the enemy or the person you're competing with is numbers, and yet you still want to make it a play activity. And the reason why I emphasize the word play here is it's not real. It may feel real. When I was in the military, we did pugil sticks and we're beating the snot out of each other with giant Q-tips. It felt real, but it was nowhere near as real as it would have felt on the battlefield with real rifles and real bayonets and the after effects of that. So one of the things about games, and you'll note that it starts to sound a lot like business terms, has rules, has conflict, has goals, involves decision making. Well, if you abstract that and put it into a business model, it sounds a lot like what you do in business. And so if you can provide an environment, if you can provide a context by which you can do things in an artificial construct, and it's safe. One of the biggest things about play, even when you're playing tag or something like a sport of something, it's relatively safe. Now, football players may tell you otherwise because of concussions and things like that, but the idea is to keep it safe or safer than what you would experience in real life, either for yourself or for the people that you're working with. If I'm running a nuclear power plant, you do not want me practicing on the real thing, okay? If I'm a doctor, you don't want me practicing on your liver for the first time. That's probably not what you want to have happen. So we want to create an environment where they can practice, but then you also want to have an environment where they are engaged in such a way that there's something meaningful coming out of it. I'm getting rewarded either extrinsically, badges and medals and things like that, or intrinsically, I feel good about myself because I did something and it achieved a goal that I was trying to achieve. So there's a term that gets bandied around a lot in the learning field right now. It's been, probably for the better part of a decade, called gamification. Okay? And people have a tendency to confuse gamification with games. And I see this all the time. We're going to gamify our learning. We're going to apply gamification to learning. And they throw a Jeopardy game in, or a crossword puzzle, or a board game where there's only one choice to follow along. It's kind of like playing Candyland. There's only one way to get off that path, and that is that you get lucky enough to get there fast enough. So I liken it to what Drew Carey does in Whose Line Is It Anyway, where all the points are made up. Everything's made up. Points don't matter. And that's kind of like the badges in gamification. It just doesn't matter. Okay, the points aren't the important part. The learning, the results that you did, the competency, the confidence you get because you've practiced it enough and you were engaged enough to practice over and over again, that's what really makes the difference. So, by the way, is this a familiar term? Is everybody familiar with this term? By the way, Starbucks, your Starbucks card, that's gamification. Every time you go in there and you get a point, they suckered you in. And they said, we're going to give you a point. We're going to gamify your beverage drink. And they do that, and that's the same thing with airline miles and everything. They all figured out, if we can turn this into some kind of game structure that you're not even aware is happening, we will get you to do it over and over again. And we'll get you to pay $5 or $6 for a cup of coffee that should cost 50 cents. Gotcha. So, how do we transition from games to corporate learning, or to university learning for that matter? Well, there's a connection point that happens, which is really kind of neat. And if you've never looked at it from this standpoint, I hope this is a chance for you to see this. So, organizational goals and incentives. Same thing as levels and points. Projects and tasks, missions and quests. Instructors and facilitators, game masters. Guess what? We have it all. We already have these elements in place in most organizations. We just didn't call it that. And if you're lucky, when you're working with your stakeholders for designing your games, you will never refer to these things. You'll always refer to these because that's what they understand. You start talking about levels. I talked to somebody about leveling up. You'd have thought I had 3 heads. What the heck does that mean, Ken? Leveling up. Well, it's progressively getting better. It's increasing my skills. I just still don't get it. Why would you level up? Well, you got to practice until you get past that point, and then we'll level you up to the next level. You know, they were like so confused over that concept in a business space. Now, if I had them on a football field, or playing tennis, and you're leveling up, that's different. For some reason, there's a mental block in a lot of corporate executives, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of subject matter experts. They just can't get past this. If you walk away with nothing else from today, this is the slide. Because this is taking games and putting it in business terms. And that's really what you're trying to do when you're designing a game for learning. So, are you ready for this? You have reached level 1. That's your badge. Gamification. You made it through the first third of the program. All right. So games are great, but we've also heard in the corporate world today that it's all about the story, right? So once upon a time, because that's what you want to do. You want to hook them in. You want to give them a reason to be a part of the story, to participate. They got to have something invested in this. Somewhere you're going to identify, whether it's learning binary or whether it's learning how to, suture somebody or whether you're learning how to make a business deal. You got to have a story, and that story provides the context. Even if the game itself is a total abstraction. My favorite thing about games is that you can use allegories, metaphors, analogies, and abstractions to teach people specific portions of what they need to do in their role in a business without them actually having to be in that mode when they're taking the course or when they're learning the material. Some of this is just repetition. I did work for the FAA. We had to teach them 4 pages. These are 4 8.5 by 11 pages, front and back, of aircraft terms and acronyms. This was 2 columns per page, over 400 or 500 of these things. They have to memorize. They have to be able to recall them on a second, less than a second. Or you've got a plane that's supposed to be heading to Washington State, heading to Washington, D.C., and it's going to crash into the other plane that's now going the wrong way. So we had to come up with a way to do that. And we had to come up with a game because memorizing that many terms without being able to without practicing going through it would take forever. And we had to do it in less than 5 years. Actually, we had to get it down to 3 years. So that was a great thing, and we were able to do it because we abstracted it and turned it into a card game. Okay? And it wasn't original. They used to do that back in World War II and in Korea. They put the pictures of the little bombers and the different aircraft and the different military equipment. And while they were playing poker, on the backside, everybody else was looking at the cards, seeing the different aircraft. It was an abstraction. They didn't know they were learning, but they were learning. So, when you tell a story, you want to keep it tight. You don't want to bog them down with the story. So, if you were going to start a game and you want to tell a story and you want to keep it tight, well, you want to talk about a situation about something, A. It takes place in location B. The main character wants to do or wants to be or wants something, C. It all began with D, and it ends when E happens. Tight story. Doesn't have to be very long, but it's enough to give the context to draw somebody in. And you want to, if you have the opportunity, give the player some level of autonomy so they can make changes and decisions and choices that shift the focus of the specific scenario, and they feel like they have some kind of influence on it. And if they don't, then what happens is that they're just doing something rote. I saw a great example. I'm trying to remember the lady's name that she presented on the first night, Tuesday night. And one of the things that they were doing was a medical simulation, or medical game. And when you responded to one of the choices that you had to be able to choose from, things changed in the game. It was a branching game. And the great thing about her game, and I want to use the idea now, is rather than waiting to the end to give the feedback of, okay, you did all these things right except for this thing, you had a bad conversation with Bob. Instead, you got immediately the opportunity to replay it. If it didn't go right, if it didn't go well, you could replay it. And even if it did go well, you could replay it and see what would happen if I chose one of the other options. Because that's half the battle. You do something in business and you make a decision, and then you're like, well, what if I'd done it this way? Or what if I'd done it this way? Wouldn't it be great to know what would have happened? And sometimes the least obvious answer is the right one. And it just depends upon the nature of the context of the business. So you want to have those kinds of opportunities. Now, I say all of that to then also fall back and say you don't have to have a story to have a good business game or a good learning game. A story just connects people to it in an emotional way that they might not otherwise. So it's not required, and not all games need it, but if you do have the opportunity, having a good storyline really pays off. So we talked about the situation a few seconds ago. You start with the situation. This was a piece that I did for Ingersoll Rand. They own Trane Air Conditioning and Ingersoll Rand tools and things like that. And we were having a problem with cash flow in the company. And more importantly, we're trying to help the employees of the company understand that even the things that they do that may not have anything to do with the direct manufacturing of the products we were making can impact cash flow. And so we came up with this game. You would make some settings and make some decision points, and based upon what you were doing, you impacted the way that the game flow went, and you were trying to get the tank of money to fill up. And it was simple things like print on both sides of the paper when you're printing out printouts. Print in black and white, not color ink for everything. Those kinds of things. Don't take pens home with you for your kids to use for their homework. Well, what's so funny is those things added up to like millions of dollars. And because they were able to see it, within a matter of a couple of months, we shifted the cash flow in a positive direction, not just in the game, but in the company. And that was a pretty amazing thing. So, it's great to have a situation. You've got to have a world for it to take place in. Now, the world can be a 3D world. It can be a 2D world. Either works depending upon the context of what you're trying to convey and what it is you're trying to accomplish. And we're going to talk about goals and objectives in a second. But just notice the world is one of the characters. It's the environment that everything takes place. And while that seems obvious, there are a lot of games where this gets left out, at least the detailing around it. And this sets the mood, the character, and sometimes this can substitute for the whole story. If you can get your context across with just a picture, more power to you. So, there are players. Now, sometimes the players are real. Yes, this is Neverwinter Night. But the characters... Ooh, that's really good. The characters can be humans. They can be non-humans, if you want to make it that way. Whatever your company or your learning environment feels comfortable with. You know, one of the challenges that you will run into is, especially today, with emphasis on diversity, inclusion, and equity, is you want the characters to represent in some form or fashion the audience that you're working with so that they can relate to them. And sometimes that means making them like us, and sometimes it means abstracting it and making them not like us at all. You could have shapes. You know, it doesn't, that part is a matter of working with your stakeholders and your focus groups within the organization so that it reflects what they'll best learn in. Because you don't want the story or the environment to be a distraction. You want it to be a part of the game. And then the Game Master. This is actually a screenshot from an old IBM Innovate game. Some of the IBMers are here. And the Game Master is interesting because you can have a live human being be the Game Master. You can have a rules-based engine be the Game Master. You can have AI be the Game Master. Or you could have a non-Game Master where each of the players that are involved, especially if we're doing a multi-user game, the players themselves become the Game Masters, overseeing and ensuring that the rules are followed and things take place. And you made it to level 2. Another badge. Do you feel excited? That's an extrinsic motivation right there. Right there. Now, if you feel warm on the inside and feel like you're coming away with something, that's intrinsic. And that's all about you. So, I'm going to show you a real quick video about a game called the World Peace Game.
You might wonder, how do we even begin to solve this issue? How do we stop people fighting? China's just made it clear. And how do we create world peace? They're questions that top world leaders struggle to deal with pretty much every day. But what if I asked you to find the answers? Well, I'm not going to ask you to do that. But this guy might.
I'm John Hunter, the inventor of the World Peace Game and actually the CEO of the World Peace Game Foundation.
The World Peace Game is kind of like a board game, but it's also way more than that.
Oh my, the World Peace Game is a gigantic structural geopolitical simulation. And essentially, we have a number of different countries pitted against each other in every way, politically, socially, militarily, and economically. And they're pitted against each other on 4 different levels: outer space, aircraft level, ground and sea, and undersea level. And the children who are playing these roles of cabinets and agencies in the world have to sort through all of this chaos and actually create solutions to solve some of the world's toughest problems.
At the beginning of the game, the participants get detailed documents explaining the problems they have to solve and get assigned different roles within the game. There's prime ministers, chief financial officers, and a heap of different staff in organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank. And then they have to work together to figure it all out.
So basically, each country has a budget from the beginning, and you win the game by each country's budget being higher than before, and all 23 crises solved.
John says he came up with the game when he first started working as a teacher. and had to teach his students about what was going on in Africa.
I thought, how am I going to do that? It's a very complex place. But I thought I'd make a game of it.
Since then, it's grown to include problems facing the entire world.
We have everything from ethnic and religious and minority rights and problems, religious struggles. We have breakaway republics. We have water and famine issues. We have poverty. We have pollution. We have fishing rights issues. Everything we have in the world, cyber warfare, all of that is in the World Peace Game. We just sort of rip it from the headlines and modify it appropriately for children. And in a bloodless way, they always, always, always save the world.
John says that while it is possible to lose the game, that's never happened. And he reckons it shows that kids are actually pretty amazing at this stuff. And while it's difficult, these guys say it's really fun.
It's helping me to understand more of the values and things you need to learn for life.
I think it's a big challenge to solve the problems in the world. Obviously, there's a lot more problems than just on this game board behind me.
It's the best feeling in the world when you solve a crisis and everyone's like jumping around like, yeah, we solved a crisis.
So, what's fascinating about this guy, and if you ever get a chance to go to his site, it's the World Peace Game Foundation. I've got the link in one of the slides, in the last slide. There's a book out on this and everything. This guy started this back in 1978. This is for fourth graders. They solved 23 major conflicts that are affecting the world, from everything from geopolitical to environmental to everything. It is an amazing thing to watch. There's a much longer TED Talk that goes into the whole game. It is an amazing thing to watch and to listen to the kids talk about what they were able to accomplish and how they accomplished it. Now, my dream is to, at some point in time in my career, have a bunch of adults play a game that's at that level where they could experience transforming their businesses in an experimental or in a game-like fashion. Obviously, a little bit more condensed than an entire year. They spend a year for this. The resource book for this, outside of the news articles and things like that, is The Art of War. You have 9-year-olds reading The Art of War and applying what they learn to the game. It is an amazing thing to watch. But what it really shows is this. This guy sat down. It was his first teaching assignment. And he said, how in the world am I going to teach American kids in Virginia how the world works? As part of the social studies program he was in. And it was an amazing. But one of the things here, and B.S. Skinner, who's a clinical psychologist and other things, he said something I thought was really interesting. Many instructional arrangements seem contrived, just like this. It's very manufactured to be able to achieve something. But there's nothing wrong with that. It's the teacher's function to contrive conditions under which students learn. It has always been the task of formal education to set up behavior which would prove useful or enjoyable later in a student's life. I cannot think of anything better than a game to do that. So, how do you get there? Well, let's take the last part of this and let's talk about that. There are some great tools out there. There's a tool called the Game Design Toolkit. It is open source. You can download it. There are links in the last slide. This is a complete toolkit with thought-provoking cards on how to do the research and what questions you need to be asking. You know, how to set the learning goals and objectives for the game. What are you going to test to make sure that the game actually worked? How do you get around some of the issues that when you call something a serious game, the game becomes more important than the serious in the minds of your stakeholders. You have to show what the business results are going to be. And that goes back to the learning goals. If you can define your learning goals, just as if it was a boring 45-minute e-learning course, if you can define your learning goals and then show how the impact will be measured at the end and what you think the impact is going to be after the fact, and then measure it as a result of people playing your game, that will help you gain credibility with your stakeholders. And after you achieve your first one, it's always a challenge, but after you achieve your first win, it becomes that much easier to say, hey, we were able to do it here, can we do it here? The biggest one that I think gets overlooked from time to time is what is your final deliverable? So, depending upon where you're at in the stage of the company you're working for, the university, or whatever, that deliverable is going to vary. It may be a live board game. It may be a card game. It may be a virtual card game on your phone. You know, we have a lot of things that speed up the process of setup of games now, because I can do it digitally. Still a game, it's still a board game or a card game, but now setups like this because it just resets. Is it a VR headset game? Is it a first-person shooter? Those things need to be decided before you start coding, before you start writing it. You need to figure out, okay, based upon these goals and the conditions of the company I'm working for, let's not try to do something that we know is going to get shot down because it doesn't work within the infrastructure of the company or what it is you're doing. Let's look at something that can be achieved, take the win, and then when they say, yeah, but could you do it online? Then you do it online. And you say, yeah, give us $500,000, we'll do something online. Those are the kinds of questions when you're sitting down to start your design. Is you want to come in with solid research and you want to work with your partners to achieve these. What you don't want to do is go in and say, hey, we want to build a game. If you start your conversation with those words, you're dead in the water. What you want to do is you want to say, we want to make a business impact that will result in these things in this amount of time for this amount of money. Okay, now you're in the business seat. Okay, it's not an indie game. It's not a game that's sponsored by a publishing company. You're talking in terms of business and the business language of business that will help you get to this. Okay? Because once you've established that there's a need and you've laid that out, then you can start looking at the mechanics. If we go back to those earlier slides, we go back to the mechanics of the game. And we go back to the system itself. Do we want to make it, a card game or a walk-around discovery game? Or do we want to make it to where it's a communication type game? Those pieces will help you succeed in doing this. Once upon a time, an IB wanted to make a serious game. Okay? So you do the exploration part, the consulting and the analysis. You do the discovery part. That's setting up your learning strategy. You create it. And you start by creating the design plan, just as if you were doing any kind of learning course. You share it. How do you share it? Well, you can do wireframes. You can do, a one-pager. Type it out. You can actually do a storyboard with branching and all that kind of stuff. I caution you when you start going down the branching path of things, start simple. show one scenario or one part of a scenario and how the branching works. Because if you go into them with a twine drawing, does everybody know what twine is? Okay. If you go in with a twine drawing of all the branches, they will go, we have to review that? How long is that going to take? Well, it might take 4 hours to go through it the first time, and then you got to go to the alternative branches. It might take a week. Oh my God, I don't have that much time. My subject matter experts don't have that much time to review this. Okay, don't do that. Get them hooked on the candy first. It's kind of like, your dealers, okay? And you want to deal them into what it is that you want them to come back for more. Yeah, we want more of this. And then play. Focus groups are, I cannot tell you how much focus groups are important in what you're doing, okay? And start the focus groups early. Don't wait till you have something that looks really glossy. Start with a wireframe. Start with pencil sketches. And have focus groups give you a reaction. See if they're actually learning anything from your game. Check the behaviors. See both the behaviors of as they're playing as well as the behavioral outputs that you get at the end. It's very fascinating to watch a focus group. A lot of times people go, oh, we're going to send it out. We've got people in this city and this city and this city. You're going to do it. It's like, okay, who's going to observe? Because watching someone play a game is different than having them write up what they think that they experienced. Okay, that's very much in the same way as game design. Period. Whether it's a first-person shooter or this, but it's really important to watch that because you will know when they're bored, and you will know when they're confused, and you will know when they are really engaged and excited. And then reflection. This is the part from a corporate learning standpoint or from a university learning standpoint that's really, really important. You have to build in reflection points, much in the same way as cutaway or cutscenes are for regular games where you're doing a load. Well, you're kind of letting them load this into their head when you give them reflection time to reflect on what they just did, the impacts and the things that it did to them. They may even want to share it with their friends. And then they continue on. And in some games I've seen that are really good, you have the option. Do you want to go back and try that again? Or are you ready to continue? You actually give them a decision point where they can choose to go back. Because they start reflecting and they're like, God, I need to reread that paragraph. It's kind of like when you're reading through a book. And then last, results. Were the desired training outcomes achieved? Because at the end of the day, if you don't get that, nothing else matters. Okay? So, how do we do that? Well, you got to keep it challenging. Now, this drawing is, I can never pronounce this person's name, but he's brilliant. He came up with this concept called flow. And flow is all about being somewhere between anxiety and boredom. And a good game fluctuates a little bit like this, like a sine wave going through here, keeping you in the flow, but allowing you to have a level of anxiety and some boredom. I mean, you want to avoid the boredom as much as possible, but you don't want them so amped up that they burn out by the time they finish the first level too. Okay? So flow is really important. And 4 warning signs for your game. If the players are bored, if they're bored on everything but their turn where they're doing something, in other words, when you have this is for multiplayer, but when you have a multiplayer game and people are doing stuff and only the person who is actually doing the action at that point in time is excited, that is not a good game because you will lose them. Players are not engaged or seem confused about what to do. That's a game mechanics issue. Okay? And what that means is this. Don't make the game so complex that it becomes the hardest challenge they have to do. If your scoring mechanism is so complex that they have to do calculus to figure out what they got, it is too hard. Okay? And if they can't figure out where the play button is on their VCR, let me put it this way. If you can't figure out the play button on YouTube, then we got a different issue. And then if one player beats everyone else by a huge margin, in other words, they just slaughter them, kind of like when my brother and I played Monopoly. Okay, that's not challenging. That's defeatism. At that point, it's kind of like when you have leaderboards and you got one guy that's way up here and you're starting down here and you're like, there's no way I'm ever going to get up to here. How do you keep them engaged? Well, there are ways of doing that. So scoring is an interesting thing as well when it comes to serious games. Now I'm watching my time here. So scoring is an interesting thing. Most adults in a learning environment in a corporation don't want to be scored unless you're a salesperson. That's a different group. That's a whole different type of people. Okay? But most of them don't want to. They want their feedback to come indirectly. So my action caused something to happen which resulted in something else down the road. Now what they don't know is we're keeping score and we're figuring out are the customers happy, are the customers sad, blah, blah, blah. So the scoring is not visible, but what you're doing is impacting the way the gameplay is done. Okay? Because scoring can be an antithesis to the learning process because they become more worried about the score than they are about the actual learning and the content. Another thing about scoring when you're talking about leaderboards, and this is where the salespeople come in, is you want to bracket your leaderboard. They can only see the range within a certain scope of where they are, and they're not aware that there are people that are so far beyond them that they would never be able to make a dent into it. That allows them to say, hey, in my peer group of these 10 people, I'm doing pretty good. But if I'm comparing myself to everybody, I'm like way down here. And that, again, it defeats the purpose of what you're trying to do. So, real quick, you made it to level 3. We made it with 2 minutes to spare. I will take questions. Yes? So that's where abstraction, metaphors, allegories come into play. And it is a way of saying, okay, it's less about the physical way you're learning the material and the location, and more about I'm focusing on the content and the true context of how I would be applying it. For example, there have been studies about boys and girls learning math, for example. And when kids are younger, both types of children tend to learn better when they're exercising and learning math concepts, like the addition tables and multiplication tables, stuff like that. Boys in particular need to be out there running around and doing math while they're doing it. Teachers that can put that concept of mathematics that used to be done on the blackboard instead out there on the basketball court or on the track or on the baseball field, and they're calculating percentages for batting. Those things really play a big, because you start realizing it's not that they don't know math or they can't learn it. It's the environmental constructs in which they're learning math that need to have it applies relevance. girls do the same thing, but just in different ways. Girls also have much better social skill development at those younger ages when they're allowed to have it in the context. So tea party, and this is not to say, okay, girls have to do tea party, but I got two very powerful women. Don't go down that path. But I have two very powerful women in my house, my daughters, and they'll be the first to tell you, it's not just about the tea party, Dad, it's about the social impacts. We did the same thing when we were climbing trees and building houses and stuff like that. So the point is that it's the environmental context that you're teaching the material that's the important part, and making sure that that matches the content. There are times, and this is where, again, the game abstraction comes into play. You may feel like you're not learning anything, and the reality is you're learning a lot. Now, not to say that Karate Kid is the greatest student ever, but wax on, wax off, wax on, wax off. I didn't learn anything. What's the matter? And that guy starts beating the crap. Okay. Totally different concept. He abstracted what he was doing. He learned things that he didn't know he was learning through repetition and practice. And all of a sudden, he was able to do it. Now, that was an extreme. But it does work for a lot of activity and for a lot of content. Yeah.
So we were talking about learning games for kids.
Yep.
Is there a way that we can
Yeah. So again, it's a matter of so kids, when you're dealing with children, there's a base level of knowledge they don't have yet. So your games, the context of those games has to be, in many cases, simplified. In the case of John Hunter's game, he amped it up. He said, well, if I want to have them save the world, I got to teach them the art of war. Okay? So he didn't set the bar lower, he set the bar higher. Now, granted, by the time they're 9 years old, they can read to some degree, to a degree that allows them to be able to do that. But they still had to have conversations about the material. But the material to them was relevant. And relevance is the other thing. So it had to be relevant. So not many 9-year-olds will sit down and read The Art of War. However, if it's to win a game, you'd be surprised what you're learning. And so they sat down and they were learning The Art of War. And so the relevance is the important part. When you become an adult, it's even more important. If I don't see the relevance at some point for where this is going to contribute to the other part of it, and I have to start seeing impact of that pretty fast. So if I'm playing the game and I know that let's say it's a game on business ethics, and I've read through my ethics, paper that they give you and you have to sign off on in the company, and I can immediately see how that is now giving me the answers to be able to do the things and make the decisions we're making in the game. The faster I see that relevance, the more effective the game is at keeping me engaged. Now, the game may still suck, but at least it's keeping me engaged. Okay? But again, it's because I have, 20 years or 18 years of basic knowledge skills that I've built up to. This is one of the reasons why, from a diversity standpoint, that it's challenging when you're doing global games and when you're doing even games in different environments within the United States. Because if you don't have that informational background, that knowledge background, and experience background in your early formative years, it's that much harder to apply the relevance. Yeah.
My question is about, you mentioned engagement, where you're just seeing the dip into anxiety and maybe something to look for. How do you, for an educational or learning game, deal with like failure states? Or should it be possible to lose?
Yeah. So we did a game. It was a small business simulation game where you got to play the small business person, and it was so that bankers could learn how small businesses, small business owners have to go through all the things, the decisions that they make, and some of them have nothing to do with the bank at all. And we designed the game, and we got pushback. And at the beginning, we got pushback. We said we want them to be able to fail. We want the business to be able to crash and burn, and then they can try it as many times as they want. And the subject matter experts and the intellectual people, they were like, no, you can't let them fail. You can't let them fail. That's a bad precedent, and it makes it look like we're bad. We're like, no, we're trying to get people to realize, and bankers realize that this is something that happens. It was a restaurant that you were building, right? So restaurants fail a lot, and but when we were able to allow them to fail, the emotional connection, and also just recognizing all the different variables that go into a restaurant and the decision points and how early decisions can make long-lasting differences, those things all came into play, and it enabled them to better understand how to communicate with small businesses and to be able to manage that relationship that you have with it. So while failure was a toughie, you didn't want to fail, it did build a knowledge and an understanding that would not have been possible otherwise.
So it sounds like there's depending, I guess, on the educational objectives, there is a spot there.
Yep. The other way to deal with failure is reset. I want to try it a different way. You need to give them some kind of option. Even Mario Brothers, if you fail, granted, sometimes you have to go back 32 levels and zip your way through it, or get a cheat code. But the point is that without failure, there's also not that feeling of accomplishment once you get past it, and that's the real game out of it. Now, you don't want to make the failure so bad that they're not ready for it. So you get a cheat code and you're at 32, but you've never gone through the other levels to prepare yourself, then you're going to fail a lot because you didn't get a chance to learn the basics. So that's part of the game design, is figure out how do I level people up so that when they do hit the point where something big is happening, that they're prepared for it. They may fail the first time, they may fail a second time, but they will eventually make it past that level, and then they're ready to start the next level of the game.
So, for example, if your educational games for bankers and you're looking at the scenario of a restaurant failing, is there any sort of remediation built into that says, well, here's where it went wrong, but here's how you can avoid it in the future? Or is that really the onus is on the restaurant owner and there's nothing the banker can do about it?
In real life, they can be a friendly ear to listen and commiserate, and they understand more about what's happening. Depending upon the nature of the thing that the failure was at, it may be something we can give advice on. It may not be, and that's something that has to be figured out in the game. The feedback. We were doing final feedback sheets based upon what I saw yesterday. Having that reset option on, I wanted to make a different choice. That would be an interesting mode of the game to play. So you could have the game play where I have a reset option, or I have to play it through as if I am going through this game. So to have that different thing, again, from a leveling up standpoint, to have that reset functionality as like a level 1 or a remediation level, but I have to try to go through the game for real first, would be interesting. We have to do some focus groups to figure that out.
Because I'm thinking, as I'm understanding it, it's this type of game is enabling the banker to experience empathy.
Yes.
So if that's the end goal, then it's successful.
Well, it's empathy and also understanding the challenges that the small business person goes through. So it was familiarizing them with all the different decisions they have to make, but also if they were to fail, then empathy.
But I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but if they're gaining knowledge about the different things that a restaurateur has to juggle,
Yep.
how does that empower the banker? Like, what's the real benefit other than the understanding? How do they take that understanding and put it into action to establish a better outcome for the bank?
Because we do small business consulting, and if we know ahead of time, hey, look, if they make a choice to choose a used freezer, that if it fails, they could lose like an entire inventory of meat, then you might advise them otherwise. We're not selling them the freezer. We're just saying, hey, you're better off doing this than this, or have you considered? It's not even better off. It's have you considered it? Because again, the phrasing is real important in the banking business.
Making them aware of setting them up for success at the same time.
Yeah, and there was somebody back. Yeah. Sorry, I can hear Rick song.
Sorry, so following up on the yes or no good enough choices.
Yeah.
If you are creating a business environment where the choices you make don't aren't necessarily progressing on the way that you have to have that, how would you answer that in the game?
So, again, it's all about depends. So, if those decisions, while they themselves are not inherently good or bad decisions to make, the branching structure based upon that may be a momentary blip of a response back from the environment or from the other participants, but then you get back on the same track you would have been normally, whatever it is. If it's a situation where the immediate results are if it's a non-issue, but down the road, a month or so later, it's impactful, then that hidden score I was talking about, that keeps track of all the decisions you've made, and it may impact later on. And but it's not an immediate. So you have two different ways to do it. You can have a null branch where basically it says, oh, well, thank you, and the person walks away. Or you have a long-term effect. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe just to answer a question a little bit, they do make these really beautiful voices. Some of them are really funny, where you can kind of put on it. But even if you kind of learn something from that voice, like, here's what you did, but maybe in this situation it's going differently. Or, but if you're curious, he has a prototype on it's like health impact studio. It's a prototype up on there. He got a very early prototype up there next. So it's like curious.
Yeah, and you can provide different levels of feedback.
So we just finished one. It's a call simulation, and you do data entry while you're having a call with a customer, or a client, and based upon the decisions that you're making, we're providing feedback that said, hey, you entered that data wrong, or you didn't listen clearly enough, or maybe you should have written down that number when they were telling it to you and not tried to memorize it, things like that. Just little hints. It's not a major failure, but it is it's a hint. But it depends upon how much you want to give away to the learner and how much you want to force them to discover the information on their own. Sometimes, if you miss a piece of information, you got to ask the person again, hey, I didn't remember what you said. And while you may lose some intangible points because you have to ask them twice, it carries through. Yeah. It's funny you say that. So I did a course for a school in Polk County,
It was a study when I was getting my master's degree at East Carolina, Pirate. And it was on the quadratic formula. And I turned it into an interactive story. And you had to make decisions going along the way. You went on this adventure, and you had to use the quadratic formula to solve things like shooting a cannonball to knock down this beaver's nest and stuff like that. It's nonsensical. But by the time it was done, you knew the quadratic formula. In part because every time you went to go do something, it's saying that stupid song, is the song about the quadratic formula. So it was pretty much drilled into your head at that point. Does it replace the whole thing? Absolutely not. Could you? Yeah, I suppose you could create a series of these games where you could potentially replace the whole course. I know my kids played Madeline, and they learned the basics of math and all their addition stuff. So yeah, it really depends on how much you want to put into the game and how much you go, this would be just as easy to have as a 2-page reading assignment. And that's from an instructional design standpoint where you have to look at the scaffolding of the course and say, okay, what is the best modality for this type of information so that they can be successful? I see anybody else? One more.
So you have an idea of applying the world to a business organization.
Yes.
Do you think if working with a company that would be really hard for those directors and executives to go to that meeting
Yeah. So one of the interesting challenges with playing a game like that with adults is the ego factor. And so that's there are some inherent issues when you're dealing with corporate executives or just adults in general that have to do with ego and also fear of failure. We have been drilled into our heads since we were 2 that failure is bad. Now that's changed over the last several years. It's still being treated as bad. Let's face it. Okay, no participation awards around here. That's just the way it is. When we can get past that and finally get to the point where it's like, okay, these are wicked problems. These are difficult things to learn in school without practical application. And if you can do a game where you can apply all of that information, all those skills at one time, that there's meaningful value to them. We're not there yet, but I would love to see it. And I think last question, and I think they're starting to wave flags back there, but yeah.
It's just to add to your thing. You talk to executives who are really high up. You want to relate to them with a return on investment on the training that they're using. For example, I've worked on a burn care simulation, and it comes down to like, do you really want your students to have to run for fear of whatever, test that, or do you want them to test in a virtual environment, be safe to make the mistakes that they want to detect, and save yourself money on having to acquire this kind of issue? Because there are synthetic cadavers, and they're like $10,000 a pop at the lowest level. So when you frame it like that to an executive, they're like, oh, you know how to save money? Here's your budget.
Yeah.
That's usually how it goes.
Yeah, I know that there are some games where the alternative lawsuit is so expensive that it's a no-brainer to do a simulation or a game or something that can get people not to do something crazy. I mean, when I was at Ingersoll Rand, we had a guy get decapitated, and it was a cutting machine, and that's because he didn't do the lockout tagout like he was supposed to. It was a tragedy beyond tragedies, but it's something that could have been addressed through a game where you had, practice after practice after practice, and no matter how boring the day was or how many times you've done the lockout tagout, you didn't forget, because the alternative was death. That's a pretty good reason to do a game. All right, I've been told I got 1 more minute, so let's leave it on a happy note, because that was kind of like, oh wow, that was harsh. All right, going once, going twice. Thanks, everybody.